The whistle sounds at 11 in the morning, and it is loud enough that gulls 200 feet above the pier scatter in every direction at once. The ship is 44,000 tons of riveted steel, close to 900 feet from bow to stern, and it will not move for another 6 minutes. But the whistle is the signal that everything from this point forward has begun. On the boat deck, a brass band is playing something bright and forgettable, the kind of tune designed to be forgotten the moment it stops. And, under it, hundreds of paper streamers stretch from the rail down to the pier, red and gold and white, already beginning to snap as the gap of water between the hull and the dock starts, almost imperceptibly, to widen. A woman stands at the first-class rail in a drop-waist silk gown the color of pale champagne. Her name, for tonight, is Eleanor Vance. She is 34 years old, and she is holding one end of a streamer that connects her, for these last few seconds, to a cousin standing on the pier below. And when the streamer finally pulls taut and snaps, she does not flinch. She has practiced not flinching. Her hair is bobbed short under a close-fitting cloche hat. A rope of pearls sits against her collarbone, and the scent around her, a mixture of French perfume and the ship's fresh paint and the ocean itself, is the smell that the White Star and Cunard lines have spent a great deal of money manufacturing. This is the smell of arrival, before you have gone anywhere. This is the smell of luxury, engineered. The ship is called, for our purposes tonight, the liner. It is 1923. The crossing is New York to Southampton, and it will take 5 days. Eleanor has crossed the Atlantic 3 times before, and each time the ritual of departure has felt the same to her. The band, the streamers, the slow, dignified pull away from the pier that makes it seem as though the ship is not so much moving as the entire city of New York is quietly sliding backward, releasing her. Around her, the boat deck is crowded with passengers performing the same small ritual of farewell, hundreds of streamers connecting hundreds of hands to hundreds of relatives and friends on the pier below, and the collective effect, viewed from a distance, is a ship draped in ribbons of color against a hull painted a brilliant, gleaming white. Newspaper photographers positioned on the pier capture the scene for tomorrow's society pages, and the image they will print, a graceful vessel wreathed in streamers and waving passengers, is precisely the image the shipping line has spent considerable money to manufacture. Nothing about this scene happened by accident. The band's placement, the choreography of the departure itself, the specific hour chosen to maximize both daylight and the crowd of well-wishers on the pier. All of it was designed deliberately to produce exactly the photograph now being taken. What Eleanor does not know, what almost none of the 600 first-class passengers standing at that rail this morning know, is that 200 feet under her silk shoes, in a space with no windows and no fresh paint and no smell of perfume whatsoever, 30 men have already been at work for 2 hours, and they will not stop, not for a single minute, until this ship reaches England 5 days from now. That is where we are going tonight. Not to the ballroom first. Down, into the iron belly of the ship, to meet the men who make the chandeliers glow. Here is the thesis of everything you are about to hear. A 1920s ocean liner was marketed with tremendous success as a floating luxury hotel. The advertisements showed marble staircases and Turkish baths and dining rooms with domed ceilings of leaded glass. They showed string quartets and afternoon tea and deck chairs arranged in perfect rows under striped awnings. What those advertisements did not show, what the entire design of the ship was built to conceal, was the fact that none of it moved on its own. The marble staircase, the domed ceiling, the 5-course dinner service, every ounce of comfort on every deck of that ship was being purchased continuously, in real time, by a group of men working in a temperature that would be dangerous to human life anywhere else in the world. This video is about the gap between those two realities. Not a polite gap, a real one, measured in decks and degrees. This was not a single ship's arrangement, unique to one unusually stratified vessel. Every major transatlantic liner of the 1920s, whether flying the flag of the White Star Line, Cunard, or any of their competitors, was built on this exact same principle. A passenger experience of manufactured effortlessness resting directly on top of a labor force of several hundred men whose working conditions would, by any modern standard, be considered a genuine humanitarian concern. Across the full fleet of liners crossing the North Atlantic in this decade, tens of thousands of men spent their working lives in boiler rooms just like the one we are about to enter. And their collective labor, largely uncredited and almost entirely unphotographed, made possible the entire romantic mythology of the era's golden age of ocean travel. Consider, for a moment, exactly how strange this arrangement actually is when you say it out loud. A woman in silk and pearls sits down to roast pheasant and charlotte russe served on bone china, while 200 feet beneath her, a man strips to his undershirt and shovels 12-pound loads of coal into an open flame, sweating through his clothes within 20 minutes, drinking oatmeal water to keep his muscles from seizing. Both of them are, at this exact moment, on the same ship, crossing the same ocean, heading toward the same destination. Neither of them chose the specific circumstances of their birth that placed them where they are tonight. And the entire physical and architectural design of the vessel carrying them both has been engineered with remarkable sophistication to ensure that they never once have to confront that fact directly. We are going to go down into the boiler rooms first, into a cavern of iron and fire that most first-class passengers never saw and were never meant to see. And we are going to meet a stoker named Michael Doyle, who has been shoveling coal into a firebox for 3 years and who will do it again tonight, for 4 hours, in a room where the temperature routinely reaches 120 degrees. Then we are going to come back up, all the way up, to the first-class dining room, where a woman named Eleanor Vance will sit down to a dinner of 6 courses, while a string quartet plays, and a steward balances a silver tray of soup against the roll of the sea without spilling a drop. We are going to trace the vibration of the engines as it travels up through every deck of that ship, the one physical thread that connects Eleanor's polished dining chair to Mick's shovel. And we are going to end, very late at night, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where everyone aboard, rich and poor, coal-blackened and champagne-soaked, is suspended together in the same small bubble of light against an enormous, indifferent dark. Before we go further, if this kind of honest history is something you value, if you prefer the real version to the polished one, take a second to subscribe. It helps us keep making these. And if you would like to, leave a comment telling me which era you find most fascinating. I read every one of them. Let us go down first, because that is where the ship's real story begins. Eleanor Vance is 34 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and she has been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, a banker named Charles, died of a heart attack in their New York apartment on a Tuesday evening in the middle of dinner. And Eleanor has spent the 14 months since then learning a particular kind of performance. The performance of a woman who is composed, capable, and entirely fine. She is traveling to London on family business, a matter involving her late husband's estate and a property near Kensington that needs attending to. And she has booked a first-class stateroom on the promenade deck, a room with a private bath, a brass bed, and a porthole that looks out onto an ocean that, for the next 5 days, will be the only view available to her in any direction. The property in Kensington was Charles's grandmother's house, left to him years before their marriage and never sold. And the matter Eleanor must attend to in London involves a dispute with a tenant and a set of legal documents that require her physical presence, or at least her signature, witnessed by an English solicitor. A requirement that could not, despite considerable effort by Charles's American lawyers, be satisfied by post alone. She did not particularly want to make this crossing, but the alternative, allowing the matter to drag on unresolved, felt somehow worse than 5 days of manufactured comfort and manufactured boredom. And so here she is, at the rail, watching New York recede. Her sister offered to accompany her, and Eleanor declined, gently but firmly, a decision that surprised even herself when she made it. There was something in the idea of 5 days entirely alone, answerable to no one, that appealed to a part of her she rarely acknowledges directly. The part that has grown tired of managing not only her own grief, but the careful, well-meaning concern of everyone around her, who watches her a little too closely, asks a little too often whether she is truly all right. Aboard this ship, surrounded by strangers who know nothing of Charles or the funeral or the 14 months since, Eleanor can, for these 5 days, simply be a woman crossing the Atlantic, unburdened by anyone's specific knowledge of exactly what she has lost. Her body, under the silk and the pearls, carries the particular tension of a woman who has spent 14 months holding herself together in public. Her shoulders are set slightly higher than they would be if she were relaxed. Her hands, when she is not consciously managing them, tend to find each other and clasp, a habit that began at the funeral and has never quite stopped. She sleeps poorly most nights, and she has brought with her a small bottle of veronal, a barbiturate sedative that her physician prescribed, which she uses more often than she has told anyone, including herself. There is a specific social demand placed on a widow of Eleanor's position and age that most people, then or now, rarely stop to consider. She is expected to be sad, but not too sad, composed, but not cold, available for conversation and dancing and the general social life of the ship, because a woman traveling alone who withdraws entirely into visible grief becomes, in the delicate etiquette of 1920 society, a source of quiet discomfort for everyone around her. Eleanor has learned through 14 months of practice exactly how much grief is socially acceptable to display, and exactly how much must be folded away, out of sight, managed privately in the minutes before sleep. She performs this balance every single day of this crossing, at every meal, at every encounter in the corridor, at every moment when another passenger, meaning well, asks how she is finding the voyage, and she answers every time with the same practiced warmth that she is finding it perfectly lovely. Eleanor has one private, humanizing habit that no one aboard this ship knows about. Each night before bed, she takes out a small leather notebook and writes, in a hand too small for anyone glancing over her shoulder to read easily, a single sentence about her husband. Not a eulogy, not a grand statement of grief, a single, specific memory. The way he hummed while he shaved, the particular impatience he showed with waiters, the morning he burned the toast and ate it anyway, rather than admit the mistake. She has filled almost half the notebook in 14 months, and she has told no one it exists. Now, 200 feet below Eleanor's stateroom, and considerably closer to the bottom of the hull than to the top, a man named Michael Doyle is standing in front of an open furnace door, and the heat coming off it is strong enough that he can feel it through his boots. Mick, as he is known to every other man in the stokehold, is 26 years old. He grew up in Liverpool, near the docks, in a house with 7 siblings and a father who worked the same trade Mick works now, and he has been a fireman, which is the specific term for a man who shovels coal into a ship's furnace, for 3 years. Before that, he was a trimmer, which is the job of wheeling coal from the bunkers to the firing floor, a job that is, if anything, more physically brutal than firing itself. And before that, at 19, he was simply a boy from Liverpool who needed work, and discovered that the one job the shipping lines were always hiring for, because the turnover was so severe, was down in the stokehold, in the heat, where most men who tried it left within the first crossing and never came back. His father, a fireman himself for close to 20 years before a bad chest finally forced him ashore, told Mick very little about the actual conditions of the job before Mick took it up himself. This was not deception exactly. It was the same instinct that kept Eleanor Vance from telling anyone about her veronal. The instinct to protect the people you love from knowledge that would only worry them without changing anything. Mick's father simply said the work was hard, the pay was steady, and a strong young man could make something of himself in the trade if he kept his head down and did not complain. Mick took the advice at face value at 19, and only fully understood what it actually meant somewhere in the middle of his first watch, standing before an open furnace for the first time, the heat hitting him like a physical wall, the noise disorienting, his hands blistering within the first hour, despite the leather gloves the shipping line provided. Mick did not leave. He is one of the men who stayed, and staying has changed his body in ways that are visible from across a room. He is broad through the shoulders and forearms in a way that no gymnasium produces, built by 3 years of swinging a 12-pound shovel loaded with coal, hour after hour, 4 hours at a stretch. His skin, even scrubbed, carries a grey undertone from coal dust that has worked its way into the pores and will likely never fully leave. He has a scar on his left forearm from a spray of hot ash that caught him in his first month, and his hearing in his right ear is already beginning to dull from 3 years of standing beside furnace doors that roar like something alive every time they open. He is saving his wages. There is a girl in Liverpool named Bridget, and Mick has told her, in a letter he wrote and rewrote 4 times before sending, that 2 more crossings, maybe 3, will give them enough to marry and rent 2 rooms above a shop on Scotland Road. He keeps her most recent letter folded in the pocket of his trousers, in a spot where the coal dust cannot easily reach it, and he takes it out sometimes, in the 4 hours between watches, and reads it by the light of a single electric bulb in the crew's mess, though the words are already memorized. Bridget works in a textile mill in Liverpool, and her letters describe a life that is, in its own way, exhausting in a completely different register from Mick's. Long hours at a loom, the particular ache of standing all day on a factory floor, a foreman she describes with careful, coded frustration that Mick reads between the lines of every letter she sends. Neither of them romanticizes the other's labor. They write to each other instead about the future they are building together, 1 crossing and 1 wage packet at a time. And Mick has come to think of this correspondence as the one part of his life aboard this ship that belongs entirely to him, untouched by furnace or foreman or the relentless rotation of the watch bell. At this moment, as the ship pulls away from the pier and the band plays on the deck far above him, and 600 first-class passengers wave streamers into the widening gap of water, Mick Doyle is picking up his shovel for the first watch of the crossing. He will not see daylight again for 4 hours. He will not see it, in any meaningful sense, for most of the next 5 days. Eleanor Vance and Michael Doyle are, at this exact moment, separated by roughly 200 vertical feet of riveted steel deck, and a difference in daily experience so complete that if you described one world to a person living entirely in the other, they would likely not believe you. They are also, in a way that neither of them has any reason to think about to spend the next 5 days on the exact same ship, moving through the exact same ocean at the exact same speed, held together by the exact same iron hull. Consider, for a moment, the specific economics that placed each of them where they are tonight. Eleanor's first-class passage cost, in 1923 dollars, somewhere in the range of $400 to $800, depending on the exact cabin. A sum that represented, for most working American families of the era, close to a full year's income. She did not think of this figure as extravagant. It was simply the appropriate cost of appropriate travel, the way a person of her position would think of any necessary expense. Mick's monthly wage as a fireman, by contrast, was approximately £5 to £6, a figure that, converted and compared honestly, meant that Eleanor's single one-way ticket cost more than Mick would earn in close to a year of continuous, punishing labor in the boiler room. He does not resent this arithmetic in any dramatic way. It is simply the world as he has always known it, the same world his father knew on the Liverpool docks, and his understanding of his own position within it is pragmatic rather than bitter. The wage is steady. The work is brutal but reliable, and reliability, for a man from Mick's background, carries a weight that someone born into Eleanor's circumstances would likely never need to fully appreciate. There is no tipping structure available to a fireman, unlike the stewards who serve first class directly and can supplement their base wage considerably through the generosity of the passengers they attend to. Mick's income is fixed, predictable, and entirely dependent on the shipping line's set pay scale, a scale that has changed only marginally in the years he has worked this trade, regardless of rising costs on shore or the genuine danger of the work itself. This predictability is, in its own limited way, part of what makes the job bearable. Mick knows, to the shilling, exactly what he will earn from this crossing, and he has built his entire plan with Bridget around that certainty. A certainty that a man in a less stable trade could not necessarily count on. Both of them boarded this ship through entirely different processes that reflect in miniature the entire structure of the crossing they are about to experience. Eleanor arrived by private car, her trunks handled by porters, her boarding pass checked by a purser who greeted her by name, having reviewed the passenger manifest in advance and noted which first-class travellers merited particular attention. Mick arrived 2 days earlier, before any passenger boarded, reporting to a hiring office on the Liverpool docks where he and several hundred other men, most of them known to the shipping line through previous voyages, were assigned to their positions for this crossing. A process that involved considerably less ceremony and considerably more physical inspection. A doctor checking each man's back, shoulders, and general fitness for the brutal labour ahead. The hiring hall itself, on the morning Mick reported, was a scene that would have been entirely unfamiliar to anyone who only ever encountered this ship through its first-class advertisements. Several hundred men stood in loose lines, coats and caps against the Liverpool damp, waiting to learn whether they had been selected for this particular crossing, or whether they would need to try again for the next ship, and the next, until steady work came available. The shipping line's hiring agents moved through the crowd with clipboards, calling names, checking each man briefly for visible signs of illness or injury that might disqualify him. And Mick, who had made this same crossing enough times now to be considered a known and reliable hand, was selected within the first hour. One small mercy in a system that offered very few. This is their story. Both of them. Let us begin where the actual work of crossing the Atlantic begins, down in the dark, with the fire. Number 9 boiler. That is the designation stenciled on the furnace closest to where Mick Doyle stands tonight, and the number is a small, functional detail that tells you something important before we go any further. This ship does not have one furnace. It has dozens, arranged in rows across multiple boiler rooms, each one a separate iron chamber that must be fed, monitored, and maintained continuously. And the entire arrangement exists for exactly one purpose: to turn coal into steam, and steam into the force that turns the propellers, and the turning propellers into the 70-mile-a-day crossing that first-class passengers experience as a smooth, barely perceptible glide. If you imagine the interior of an ocean liner in the 1920s, you are very likely imagining the parts that were designed to be imagined. The grand staircase with its wrought iron balustrade, the first-class dining saloon with its columns and its domed skylight, the smoking room with its leather chairs and its mahogany paneling. These spaces were photographed extensively, described in every advertisement, praised in every travel account, and they represent, in terms of the ship's total interior volume, a relatively small fraction of what is actually inside the hull. Beneath those decks, and this is the detail that most people never learn, is an entire industrial city hidden underneath a ballroom. The boiler rooms, the engine rooms, the coal bunkers, which on a ship this size hold several thousand tons of fuel. The refrigeration plant that keeps the first-class kitchens supplied with fresh meat for 5 days at sea. The electrical generating plant that powers every light on every deck, including the chandeliers in the dining saloon that Eleanor Vance will sit under tonight. The workshops, the bakeries, producing bread around the clock for over 2,000 passengers and crew. The laundry, processing the linens and uniforms of an entire floating town. The scale of the coal operation alone is worth pausing on because the sheer volume involved is difficult to picture without specific numbers. A liner of this size, making the crossing at the speeds shipping companies competed to advertise, would consume somewhere between 600 and 1,000 tons of coal per day, depending on the ship's specific design and the speed being maintained. Across a 5-day crossing, that meant a total consumption in the range of 3,000 to 5,000 tons of coal, all of it loaded into the ship's bunkers before departure by teams of coal trimmers working in the choking dust of the dockside coaling stations, and all of it destined to be moved by hand from bunker to furnace over the course of the voyage by men like Mick Doyle and Sam Kowalski. The coaling process itself, conducted in the days before this crossing began, was a spectacle in its own right, though one rarely captured in the same photographs that documented the ship's glamorous departure. Coal barges tied alongside the hull, and gangs of men worked in relay through the night and into the following day, filling the bunkers through specially designed loading ports, the entire dock enveloped in a fine black haze of coal dust that settled on everything nearby, including, on occasion, any first-class passengers unfortunate enough to board before the coaling was fully complete. An inconvenience the shipping lines worked hard to schedule around, precisely because it offered such an unwelcome preview of what their advertisements worked so hard to conceal. The coal itself was stored in bunkers positioned along both sides of the hull, adjacent to the boiler rooms, a design choice that served a dual purpose beyond simple convenience. The coal bunkers also functioned as a layer of passive protection, absorbing the impact of a potential collision before it could reach the boiler rooms themselves, a detail of naval architecture that few passengers, admiring the ship's exterior lines from the pier, would ever have reason to learn. To reach the boiler rooms from the first-class promenade deck, you would need to descend through 9 or 10 separate levels, and the journey itself tells the whole story of the ship's hidden architecture. You begin on the promenade deck, wide and open, lined with deck chairs and windbreaks, the air smelling of salt and, faintly, of the perfume worn by the women walking past. You descend to the first-class public rooms, the library, the smoking room, the reading and writing room, each one panelled in a different exotic wood, each one carpeted in a pattern chosen specifically to disguise the small stains and scuffs of daily use. You pass the first-class cabins, some of them suites with their own private sitting rooms, their own marble bathrooms, their own steam heating. And then the character of the ship begins, gradually and then very suddenly, to change. You pass the second-class decks, plainer, still comfortable, still carpeted, but with narrower corridors and smaller portholes, occupied largely by professionals, clergy, and modest travellers who could not afford first class, but had no interest in the crowded conditions below. You pass third class, which on this particular crossing is carrying primarily immigrant families and working travellers, bunk-style accommodation with communal dining and considerably less privacy, though by the standards of the era, still a significant improvement over the notorious steerage conditions of decades earlier, when passengers of limited means were housed in conditions barely distinguishable from cargo holds. Shipping lines had learned by the 1920s that even the most modest fare deserved some baseline of dignity, both for genuine humanitarian reasons and because increasingly strict immigration inspection standards in destination countries required a minimum level of onboard sanitation and space. Below third class, you reach a threshold that most passengers of any class never cross, because there is nothing beyond it that concerns them. A watertight door, heavy and riveted, marked for crew only. And beyond that door, the air changes completely. The carpet disappears, replaced by steel deck plates, sometimes slick with condensation or coal dust. The lighting changes from the warm, filtered glow of the passenger decks to the harsh, exposed bulbs of the working ship. And the smell changes, entirely and immediately, from French perfume and fresh sea air to something that will be unmistakable to anyone who has ever stood near an industrial furnace. Sulfur. Hot metal. And under both of those, the specific mineral smell of burning coal, thick enough that it seems to coat the inside of your throat within the first 30 seconds of breathing it. This is the transition that 600 first-class passengers walking the promenade deck this morning in their silk and their pearls, will never make. They will never smell this smell. They will never see this light. They will never know, in any felt, physical sense, that the smooth glide of their dinner service is being purchased several decks below their polished shoes by men working in conditions that would be classified by any modern occupational safety standard as immediately hazardous to life. The final descent takes you down a series of steep iron ladders, not staircases, ladders, because the space narrows and the temperature rises with every level until you emerge onto the firing floor of a boiler room and the sound hits you before anything else does. It is not one sound, it is many sounds, layered on top of each other without pause. The roar of the furnaces themselves, a deep, continuous rushing noise like standing beside a waterfall made of fire. The metallic clang of shovels against the steel plates of the firing floor. The grinding rumble of coal being wheeled in from the bunkers on iron trolleys, and under all of it, a mechanical bell that rings at irregular intervals, a signal from the engine room above, telling the men on the firing floor exactly how much steam pressure is needed and exactly how hard they need to work to produce it. The light in this space is unlike anything found anywhere else on the ship. There are no portholes here, obviously, no natural light of any kind, and the electric bulbs mounted along the bulkheads provide only a dim, functional illumination that leaves much of the room in shadow. The true light source, the one that actually defines the visual character of the space, comes from the open furnace doors themselves, a shifting orange glow that throws long shadows across the firing floor and catches the sweat and coal dust on every man's skin, turning ordinary human figures into something closer to industrial silhouettes, backlit by fire, moving in a rhythm that has been repeated watch after watch for as long as this ship has been crossing the ocean. The temperature in this room, on a normal watch, sits somewhere between 100 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no ventilation in the modern sense, only large intake vents that pull outside air down into the space, air that is itself often warm, humid, and thick with the coal dust that hangs permanently in suspension. Fine black particles that settle on every surface, including the lungs of every man who breathes them for 4 hours at a stretch, day after day, for the length of a 3-year contract, or longer. This is the room Mick Doyle has just walked into. This is where his 4-hour watch begins, and this is the room that makes possible everything that Eleanor Vance is about to experience 5 decks above, without ever knowing this room exists. The men who work in this room have a name, and the name was not chosen by the shipping companies for their advertisements. It was chosen by the men themselves, or perhaps by the passengers who occasionally caught a glimpse of them coming off watch. Faces and forearms black with coal dust, moving through the crew passageways like figures cut from soot. They are called the Black Gang. The name refers to 3 distinct jobs, each one essential and each one exhausting in its own particular way. There are the trimmers, who work in the coal bunkers themselves, breaking up the coal with picks, shoveling it into wheeled trolleys or barrows, and hauling it through narrow passages to the firing floor. Trimming is often considered the harshest of the 3 jobs because it takes place in the bunkers, spaces even more confined and even more thick with dust than the boiler room itself, and because the physical labor of breaking coal and moving it manually, with no mechanical assistance beyond a wheelbarrow or trolley, is unrelentingly heavy. There are the firemen, sometimes called stokers, and this is Mick's current role. The fireman's job is to take the coal that the trimmers have delivered and feed it into the furnaces in precisely the right quantity, at precisely the right intervals, to maintain the steam pressure the engine room is calling for. This requires both raw strength and a surprising degree of skill. Throw too little coal and the pressure drops, the ship slows, and the bridge notices immediately. Throw too much, or throw it unevenly across the firebox, and the fire burns inefficiently, wasting fuel and producing excess smoke that will pour visibly from the funnels above, a mistake that senior officers watch for and correct sharply. And there are the leading firemen and engineers who oversee the process, monitoring gauges, adjusting dampers, making the constant small calculations that keep dozens of furnaces across multiple boiler rooms working in a coordinated rhythm. Because a ship this size does not run on a single furnace. It runs on the combined output of every furnace working together. And if even a handful fall behind, the entire crossing time is affected. The Black Gang, taken as a whole, represented one of the largest single groups of manual laborers employed anywhere in the maritime industry of the era. A liner of this size carried, in its engineering department alone, several hundred men, trimmers, firemen, and their supervising engineers, working around the clock in continuous rotation. Compare this to the total crew required to serve first-class passengers directly: the stewards, the waiters, the cabin staff, a group that, while substantial, was considerably smaller than the army of men required simply to keep the ship moving at all. The proportion tells its own story. The ship's most fundamental requirement, the thing without which nothing else aboard could function, consumed the largest share of its human labor. And that labor was also, consistently, the least visible, the least celebrated, and the lowest paid relative to its physical demands. Many of the men in the Black Gang came from a narrow band of dockside communities in Britain, Ireland, and increasingly, in the 1920s, from immigrant populations across Europe, who found in the coal-fired shipping industry one of the few reliable paths to steady wages. Liverpool, Cardiff, Glasgow, Southampton itself, these port cities produced generations of men who grew up expecting, in many cases, to follow their fathers into exactly this trade, the way Mick followed his own father before him. The work was understood within these communities not as a temporary hardship, but as a genuine career, one with its own internal hierarchy, its own culture, its own hard-won respect among men who understood, better than anyone standing on the promenade deck above, exactly what the job actually demanded. Michael Doyle's specific task tonight, this watch, is to fire boiler number 9 and the 3 furnaces attached to it. He works with a trimmer named Sam Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who has been on this ship for 18 months, and the two of them have developed, over dozens of shared watches, a rhythm that neither of them could fully explain in words, but that both of their bodies now perform almost without conscious thought. Sam came to this work by a path considerably different from Mick's. He arrived in Liverpool 3 years ago from a small village outside Krakow, part of the wave of Eastern European emigration that brought hundreds of thousands of people through British and European ports in the years following the war. Many of them ultimately bound for the United States, though Sam himself found steady work aboard the liners before he ever managed to save enough for a transatlantic ticket of his own, and eventually simply stayed in the trade rather than pursue the emigration he had originally intended. He speaks English competently, but with an accent thick enough that some of the other men in the boiler room still struggle to understand him fully. And the specific, wordless language he and Mick have developed over 18 months of shared watches, a system of gestures and glances and shared rhythm, communicates more precisely between the two of them than full sentences ever could. Sam wheels the coal in from the bunker in a steel barrow, dumping it onto the firing floor in a rough pile within Mick's reach. Mick, standing before the open furnace door, judges the fire by eye, a skill that took him the better part of a year to develop with any real precision. He can tell, from the color and the shape of the flames and the specific quality of the heat radiating off the open door, exactly which section of the firebox needs fuel and exactly how much. He drives his shovel into the pile, lifts a load of roughly 12 pounds, and with a single practiced motion of the whole body, not just the arms, he swings the shovel forward and releases the coal in a controlled arc that spreads it evenly across the section of the firebox that needs it. He does this again, and again, and again, in a rhythm that must be sustained without significant interruption for the full 4 hours of the watch. This labor could never stop. That is the detail that separates the boiler room from almost every other form of hard physical work in this era. A farmer could pause to rest between rows. A blacksmith could set down the hammer between strikes. But the fire in a ship's furnace, once established, requires continuous management, because a furnace that is neglected for even 15 or 20 minutes begins to lose pressure, and lost pressure means a slower ship, and a slower ship means a longer crossing, delayed schedules, and, in the era of transatlantic speed records that shipping companies competed fiercely to win, a serious commercial problem. The shoveling could not stop. If the shoveling stopped, the ship stopped, in every sense that mattered to the men who owned it. The shipping lines of this era competed openly and publicly for something called the Blue Riband, an unofficial but fiercely contested title awarded to whichever liner completed an eastbound or westbound Atlantic crossing in the fastest recorded time. This competition was not an abstract point of pride. It translated directly into ticket sales, into newspaper coverage, into the kind of reputation that determined which shipping line wealthy travelers like Eleanor Vance chose for their next crossing. And the entire outcome of that competition rested, every single time, on the sustained performance of men exactly like Mick Doyle, shoveling coal at a pace that had to be maintained hour after hour, watch after watch, for the full duration of the voyage. A single sluggish watch, one crew of firemen falling behind on a single boiler room's output, could measurably slow the ship's overall average speed and cost the line its advertised crossing time. The men in the boiler rooms were, in a very real sense, competing in a race that the passengers above them experienced only as a headline in the ship's daily newspaper, delivered to their cabin each morning with the current position, the distance covered, and the projected arrival time. All of it the direct output of labor those same passengers would never see. Leading firemen kept informal records, watch by watch, of the tonnage shoveled and the steam pressure maintained, a kind of internal competition among the boiler room crews that mirrored, in its own hidden way, the public competition among the shipping lines themselves. A fast, disciplined crew took genuine pride in maintaining pressure cleanly, without the telltale black smoke that signaled poor firing technique pouring from the funnels above. It was, in its way, a skilled trade, with its own internal standards of excellence, invisible to the passengers whose comfort depended entirely on that excellence being maintained. And the telegraph bell rings again now, a specific pattern of chimes relayed down from the engine room, and Mick reads it without needing to think, the way a musician reads a familiar piece of sheet music. More steam needed. He sets his feet, judges the fire, and swings the shovel again. The heat and the noise and the dust and the endless ringing of that telegraph bell. This is the sound and the sensation that will define the next 4 hours of Michael Doyle's life. And it will define the 4 hours after that, following a brief rest, and the 4 hours after that, for the full 5 days of this crossing. Because the Black Gang works in a continuous rotation, watch after watch, with no day off between New York and Southampton. I want you to sit with this for a moment. Imagine shoveling heavy rocks into an open oven in 120-degree heat, while the floor under you pitches and rolls with the motion of the sea. And imagine doing it in 4-hour blocks, with only enough rest between them to eat, sleep in a narrow bunk, and begin again. That is not a metaphor for hard work. That is the literal, physical description of what several hundred men were doing in shifts around the clock on every major ocean liner crossing the Atlantic in the 1920s, so that passengers like Eleanor Vance could experience the crossing as something close to effortless. For Mick, the physical toll of this work is something he has learned to manage with the same steady, unsentimental attention he brings to reading a fire. Heat, at the levels sustained in a boiler room, is not simply uncomfortable, it is genuinely dangerous, and the danger was well understood by the men who worked there, even if the underlying physiology was not something any of them could have explained in scientific terms. The primary danger is heat exhaustion, and beyond that, heat stroke, both of which occur when the body loses more water and salt through sweat than it can replace, and both of which were common enough in the stokehold that every ship maintained its own informal protocols for managing them. The men drink constantly through a watch, and what they drink is not plain water. It is a mixture that the crews called oatmeal water, a thin gruel made from oats stirred into water, sometimes with a small amount of salt added, kept in large buckets at the edge of the firing floor within easy reach. The oatmeal provided a small amount of sustained energy, and more importantly, the mixture as a whole helped replace the salt lost through sweating in a way that plain water alone could not, though none of the firemen would have described it in those terms. They simply knew, through generations of accumulated hands-on experience passed down from older men to younger ones, that plain water alone left you weak and cramping by the end of a watch, and the oatmeal mixture did not. Mick drinks from the bucket between rounds of shoveling, cupping the liquid in a tin mug that hangs on a hook near boiler number 9, and he has learned, through painful experience in his first year, exactly how often he needs to drink to avoid the cramping that used to seize his calves and forearms partway through a watch. A cramping so severe that it could incapacitate a man, doubling him over on the firing floor, while his mates covered his section of the fire until the spasm passed. He sweats through his shirt within the first 20 minutes of every watch, and by the end of 4 hours, the shirt is saturated, clinging to his skin, and the sweat itself, mixed with coal dust, forms a thin black paste across his exposed forearms and neck. His face, by the end of a watch, is streaked and blackened in a pattern that varies slightly from man to man, depending on how each individual sweats and where the dust settles on their particular features, so that experienced crew members can sometimes identify each other by the specific pattern of soot on their faces before they can make out any actual facial features in the dim light. The burns are a constant, low-grade hazard rather than a dramatic occasional one. Sparks and small embers escape the open furnace door regularly, landing on exposed skin, and the men develop, over months and years, a tolerance for minor burns that would be considered a medical emergency in almost any other occupation. Mick has dozens of small scars scattered across his forearms and the backs of his hands, each one from a spark or an ember that landed and burned before he could brush it away. And he does not think of these scars as injuries in any meaningful sense. They are simply the accumulated evidence of time spent doing this particular job. More serious burns happen too, though less frequently. A furnace door, opened too quickly or at the wrong angle, can release a blast of superheated air and flame that catches a man across the face or chest. A misjudged shovel load thrown into a section of fire that flares unexpectedly can send a spray of burning coal fragments back at the person who threw it. Sam Kowalski, Mick's trimmer partner, carries a burn scar across his left cheek from an incident 8 months ago. A flare-back that caught him while he was helping clear a clinker, the hardened, fused mass of ash and impurities that builds up in a furnace over time and must be periodically broken up and removed. A task that requires reaching directly into the heat with a long iron tool called a slice bar, working blind, by feel as much as by sight, because the glare from the open fire makes it nearly impossible to see clearly what you are doing. Clearing a clinker is, by general agreement among experienced men in the Black Gang, the single most dangerous routine task performed in the boiler room. The fused mass forms gradually as impurities in the coal fail to burn cleanly, accumulating on the fire bars until it interferes with the airflow the fire needs to burn efficiently. And once it reaches a certain size, it must be broken apart and raked out through a small door at the base of the furnace, a task performed while the fire above continues burning at full intensity, close enough that a man's forearms and face are directly exposed to radiant heat intense enough to blister skin within seconds of prolonged contact. Sam has performed this task dozens of times since his scar, each time with the same careful, deliberate caution that experience has taught him, and each time understanding that a single mistimed motion could easily produce a far more serious injury than the one he already carries. The physical demands extend beyond heat and burns into the sheer, cumulative exhaustion of the labor itself. A fireman on a 4-hour watch will typically shovel several tons of coal, lifting and throwing a load of 10 to 15 pounds with every motion, hundreds of times over the course of the watch. The muscles of the back, shoulders, and forearms bear the brunt of this repetitive strain, and it is not uncommon for men in this trade to develop chronic back pain by their late 20s. Joint problems that would today be diagnosed as repetitive strain injuries, and a general pattern of premature physical aging that most men in the trade simply came to expect by their 30s. There is also the respiratory toll, less visible but no less real. Every breath taken in the boiler room carries some amount of suspended coal dust, and over months and years, this exposure accumulates in the lungs in a way that would, decades later, be formally recognized and named. A condition called pneumoconiosis, the same category of lung disease associated with coal miners. Though in 1923, no one aboard this ship has a name for what is slowly happening inside Mick Doyle's chest with every watch he completes. He coughs, some mornings, a deep, productive cough that brings up a small amount of black-tinged phlegm, and he and every other man in the black gang have simply come to regard this as a normal, expected feature of the work. The way a man who has spent his life in a coal mine comes to regard his own cough as unremarkable, simply the sound his body makes now. The occupational medicine of this era had no meaningful framework for understanding what sustained exposure to coal dust, heat, and physical overexertion actually did to a human body over years of continuous work. There were no workplace safety regulations governing maximum permissible temperatures, no mandated rest periods, no requirement for respiratory protection of any kind. The men themselves developed their own informal understanding of the risks, passed down through years of shared experience rather than any formal medical guidance. And that understanding, while useful in a day-to-day sense, offered no real protection against the slow, cumulative damage that decades of this work would eventually produce in the bodies of men who survived long enough to retire from the trade. The medical care available to a man like Mick, should any of this cross the line from tolerable discomfort into genuine emergency, was limited to whatever the ship's surgeon could provide from a dispensary designed primarily to treat first- and second-class passengers for seasickness and minor complaints. A serious burn, a heat-stroke collapse, a crushed hand caught between a coal trolley and a bulkhead during rough seas. These injuries were treated aboard ship as best the surgeon and his limited supplies allowed, and a man judged unfit to continue his watch was, in the strict economics of the shipping line, a genuine problem. Because the fires still needed feeding, regardless of who was available to feed them. The other men on his watch would absorb the extra burden, working harder to cover the gap until the injured man recovered enough to return, or, in the more serious cases, until the ship reached port and he could be properly treated on shore. Mick has seen this happen twice in his 3 years aboard liners like this one. A trimmer named Enfield, on an earlier crossing, collapsed from heat exhaustion so severe that he lost consciousness on the firing floor, and it took 2 other men to carry him up the iron ladders to fresher air, where he lay for close to an hour before he could stand again, pale under the coal dust, shaking, and back at work the following watch because the alternative, losing his position entirely, was a risk none of these men could afford to take. This is the calculation that defines the entire trade. The body's limits are real, and they are also, in a very real sense, negotiable against the far more immediate threat of losing a job that, brutal as it is, remains one of the more reliable sources of steady income available to a man of Mick's background and education. Mick finishes his shovel load, drives the shovel into the coal pile for the next one, and glances at the clock mounted on the bulkhead near the ladder. A specific concession the shipping line makes because the men need some way to track the passage of time in a space with no windows and no natural light. 2 hours remain on this watch. He drinks again from the oatmeal bucket, wipes the sweat from his eyes with a forearm already slick with it, and returns to the fire. Above him, 5 decks up, a dressing gong has just sounded in the first-class section of the ship, and Eleanor Vance is beginning to prepare for dinner. Which brings us to the question of what dinner actually meant aboard a 1920s ocean liner, and why the answer required a level of choreographed labor that most passengers, absorbed in their own experience of the evening, never pause to consider. The dressing gong sounds at 7 o'clock, a formal signal delivered by a steward walking the length of the promenade deck, striking a set of tuned chimes, announcing that passengers have 1 hour to bathe, dress, and present themselves for dinner. This is not a casual suggestion. Dress for first-class dinner aboard a liner of this era was a genuine social requirement, enforced through the quiet but unmistakable pressure of everyone else's compliance. Men wore black tie, dinner jackets, and starched shirts. Women wore evening gowns, and the specific fashion of 1923 favored the drop-waist silhouette that Eleanor is wearing tonight. A straight, loose-fitting dress that fell to somewhere between the knee and the ankle, paired with long strands of pearls or beaded necklaces, and, for many women, a close-fitting cloche hat worn even indoors in the evening. The gong itself is a small but telling detail of the ship's design. Somewhere, mounted in a workshop below decks, a craftsman tuned that specific set of chimes to produce a sound considered pleasant and unobtrusive. A sound that would announce a genuine social obligation without ever seeming to bark an order. Compare this, for a moment, to the telegraph bell ringing at this exact same hour in the boiler room several decks below, a harsh, functional signal designed purely to convey information as quickly as possible, with no consideration whatsoever for how pleasant or unpleasant it might sound to the ears receiving it. Even the sound design of this ship, in its smallest details, reflected the same fundamental division running through everything else aboard it. Eleanor dresses with the assistance of a stewardess assigned to her section of cabins, a young woman named Alice, who helps with the small but considerably difficult mechanics of 1920s evening wear. The hooks and clasps positioned along the back of a garment that a woman cannot easily manage alone. Eleanor's gown tonight is a pale blue silk, beaded along the hem, and she pins her pearls carefully, checks her reflection in the mirror bolted to the cabin wall, and notes, with the small, private honesty she allows herself only in moments like this one, that she looks composed. She looks, in fact, exactly as a woman in her position is expected to look. Whether she feels composed is a separate question, one she does not examine too closely tonight. The etiquette governing this dinner extends well beyond the simple question of what to wear. Seating aboard a first-class dining saloon of this era was carefully assigned by the ship's chief steward based on a delicate calculation of social standing, prior acquaintance, and the specific preferences passengers had communicated, sometimes through their travel agents, weeks before the voyage even began. Eleanor's table this evening includes a retired judge from Boston and his wife, a young couple on their honeymoon, and a British diplomat returning to London after a posting in Washington. And the conversation across the 6-course meal follows a rhythm as choreographed, in its own way, as anything happening below in the boiler room. Topics of genuine controversy, politics, religion, personal finance, are avoided by unspoken but universal convention. Conversation stays within the safe channels of travel anecdotes, mutual acquaintances, and the pleasant, low-stakes observations that fill a formal dinner without ever risking real disagreement. There is a hierarchy even within first class itself, invisible to anyone outside it, but keenly felt by everyone within it. The very wealthiest passengers, industrialists, titled Europeans, occupied the ship's most expensive suites and were afforded a level of deference from the crew that Eleanor, comfortable as her own circumstances are, does not quite receive. She notices this without particular resentment. It is simply the texture of the world she inhabits, layers within layers, each one invisible from below and keenly felt from within. The most visible marker of this internal hierarchy is the captain's table, a single table in the dining saloon reserved for the ship's most distinguished passengers, an invitation extended personally by the captain himself based on social standing, wealth, and reputation. Eleanor has never been invited to sit there, in 3 previous crossings, and she does not particularly aspire to it, though she notices each evening exactly which passengers have received that particular honor, and the subtle shift in deference the rest of the dining room extends toward them for the remainder of the voyage. This is, in miniature, the same principle that governs the entire ship's architecture, a system of visible and invisible gradations, each one meaningful to the people living within it, each one entirely beside the point to the men several decks below shoveling coal into an open fire, for whom no version of first-class hierarchy has any bearing whatsoever on the shape of their day. The first-class dining saloon, when Eleanor enters it at 7:30, is one of the most elaborately designed spaces on the entire ship. It occupies the full width of the hull at its level, with a domed skylight of leaded glass rising 2 decks above the main floor, and the room is lit by electric chandeliers, dozens of them, each one drawing power from the same generating plant that Mick Doyle's furnaces, several decks below, help produce steam for. The tables are set with white linen, sterling silver and crystal glassware, and a string quartet, positioned on a small raised platform near the entrance, plays selections of light classical music throughout the meal, music chosen specifically for its unobtrusive quality, pleasant enough to notice, forgettable enough not to distract from conversation. The meal itself, on a typical evening, runs to 6 or 7 courses. Tonight's menu, printed on heavy cardstock and presented to each table, includes consommé, a fish course of grilled sole, a choice of roast pheasant or beef fillet, a selection of vegetables prepared in the French style, a savoury course, a dessert of charlotte russe, and a final course of fresh fruit and cheese, accompanied throughout by wines selected to complement each course. The preparation of this meal, for approximately 600 first-class passengers, along with parallel but somewhat simpler meals for second and third class, requires a kitchen staff of dozens, working in shifts that begin hours before the dining room opens and continue well after it closes. In a kitchen that occupies a significant portion of the ship's lower decks, and that runs its own ovens, its own refrigeration, its own bakery, on power drawn from the same electrical system that lights the chandeliers above. The kitchen itself, though considerably more comfortable than the boiler room, is its own environment of sustained physical intensity, staffed by chefs and their assistants working over coal-fired ranges and ovens in a space that grows uncomfortably warm during full dinner service, timing dozens of dishes to arrive at each table within moments of each other, so that every guest at a given table receives their course simultaneously. A logistical feat that required considerable planning and split-second coordination between the kitchen and the small army of stewards moving between it and the dining saloon above. The head chef, a Frenchman named Dubois, who has worked aboard liners of this class for over a decade, runs his kitchen with a discipline that Mick Doyle, several decks below, would likely recognize instantly, though he has never met the man, and never will. Both worlds demand precision under pressure. Only one of them is celebrated in the ship's advertising materials. Behind Dubois' kitchen sits a refrigeration plant that represents its own considerable feat of engineering, keeping fresh meat, dairy, and produce at safe temperatures for the full 5-day crossing, despite the surrounding warmth of a working ship. The plant runs on power generated by the same electrical system that lights the chandeliers and, indirectly, draws on the same chain of labor that begins with coal shoveled into a furnace several decks below. Every cold bottle of wine served in the dining saloon tonight, every fresh cut of beef, every scoop of ice cream produced for the charlotte russe, exists because that chain of labor, invisible and continuous, has not once broken down since the ship left New York. What Eleanor experiences, sitting at her assigned table, is a meal that appears, arrives, and is cleared away with what feels like effortless precision. What she does not consciously register, because she was never meant to, is the considerable logistical operation that makes this effortlessness possible. And close to the center of that operation, standing at her elbow at this exact moment, with a silver tray balanced on one raised palm, is a steward named Thomas Whitfield. And his job tonight is one of the most physically demanding forms of invisible labor performed anywhere on the ship. A steward's job, on paper, sounds simple. Carry food from the kitchen to the table, serve it, clear it away. In practice, on a ship crossing the North Atlantic, where even a calm sea produces a constant low-amplitude roll and pitch of the deck under your feet, the job requires a form of physical anticipation that borders on the athletic. Thomas Whitfield has worked as a first-class dining steward for 6 years. He is 31 years old, and in that time he has developed a specific skill that no amount of formal training could have taught him nearly as effectively as simple, repeated experience. He can feel the rhythm of the ship's motion in his own body, almost subconsciously, and he adjusts his balance, his stride, and the angle at which he holds a loaded tray in constant, minute response to that motion, all while appearing to the passengers he serves to be moving with an easy, unhurried grace that suggests none of this effort is happening at all. Tonight, carrying a tray with 6 bowls of consommé, hot enough to scald if spilled, arranged in a careful pattern that distributes the weight evenly, Thomas crosses the dining saloon at the exact moment the ship rolls slightly to port, a shift of perhaps 2 or 3 degrees that most passengers, seated and anchored by the weight of their own bodies in fixed chairs, barely register. Thomas registers it completely. His weight shifts almost imperceptibly onto his left foot. His shoulders counter-rotate a few degrees to keep the tray level, and the 6 bowls of soup arrive at Eleanor's table without a single drop spilled, without any visible sign of the constant, continuous correction that made this possible. This labor is invisible by design, and it is invisible specifically because Thomas is extremely good at his job. A less skilled steward would spill soup, would stumble, would draw attention to the physical difficulty of what he is doing, and that attention would disrupt the entire illusion that first-class dining is meant to provide, the illusion of effortless, seamless luxury, unbothered by anything so vulgar as physics or exertion. The better a steward performs, the less visible his labor becomes, which means that the passengers he serves most successfully are, paradoxically, the ones least likely to ever appreciate what that success required. New stewards learn this balance the hard way, through months of dropped plates and stumbled trays during their early crossings, often practicing in the crew mess with empty dishes before they are ever trusted with a fully loaded tray in front of paying passengers. Thomas remembers his own early months vividly, the bruised forearms from trays he failed to control properly, the quiet, patient correction from senior stewards who had once been in his position themselves and understood exactly what the learning curve demanded. By his 2nd year, the correction had become instinct, and by his 6th, instinct had become something closer to art, though no passenger dining at his table tonight would ever think to describe it in those terms. Thomas works a split shift that keeps him on his feet, moving, balancing, anticipating for close to 12 hours a day, serving breakfast, luncheon, afternoon tea and dinner, with brief breaks between services during which he and the other stewards eat their own meals, standing in a crew passageway, quickly because the schedule allows little time for anything else. His feet, by the end of a 5-day crossing, ache in a way that he has learned to simply tune out. A low, constant throb that becomes background noise the way the ship's engines become background noise to everyone aboard after the first day. Thomas came to this work by a different route than Mick Doyle. He grew up in Southampton itself, in a family with a longer tradition of service aboard passenger vessels, and he began as a bellboy at 14, working his way up through years of increasingly skilled positions before earning a place in the first-class dining room, a posting considered, within the ship's own internal hierarchy of crew positions, one of the more desirable available to a man of his background. The tips alone from a 5-day crossing with attentive first-class passengers could exceed a month's base wage, and Thomas has learned, over 6 years, exactly which small gestures of anticipatory service tend to be most appreciated and most generously rewarded by the passengers he serves. He does not resent the work, though he is honest with himself, in quiet moments, about its cost. The physical toll is real, but it is a different toll than Mick's, one measured in aching feet and a back slightly bent from years of leaning over tables, rather than in burns and heat exhaustion. Thomas has never been below the passenger decks in his 6 years aboard ships like this one. He has heard about the boiler rooms second-hand from crew members who move between departments, but he has no direct knowledge of the conditions there, and if pressed, he would likely underestimate considerably exactly how brutal that work actually is, because the ship's entire design ensures that even crew members in adjacent departments rarely have occasion to witness each other's working conditions directly. He anticipates needs before they are voiced. A passenger reaching for a water glass that is nearly empty finds it refilled before the reach is complete. A dropped napkin is replaced before the passenger has fully registered that it fell. This anticipatory service is, in its own way, a form of skilled performance every bit as demanding as Mick Doyle's fire reading, requiring years of accumulated experience to execute smoothly, and requiring, every single evening, a level of sustained physical and mental attention that most passengers never once consider. Because considering it would mean acknowledging that the seamlessness of their experience is, in fact, an achievement, purchased through someone else's continuous effort, rather than a natural feature of the ship itself. Thomas has also developed, over 6 years, a remarkable memory for individual passenger preferences, a skill considered essential to the trade and rewarded generously by passengers who appreciate being remembered. He recalls, without needing to ask, that the retired judge at Eleanor's table prefers his wine poured only 3/4 full, that the honeymooning bride takes her coffee black while her new husband takes his with cream, that Eleanor herself, on this her 4th evening aboard, has begun taking slightly smaller portions than she did on the first night, a small detail Thomas has noted without comment. The quiet, professional attentiveness of a man whose entire livelihood depends on noticing exactly this kind of thing, and never once mentioning that he has noticed it. And here is the paradox that sits at the center of this entire crossing. The detail that, once you notice it, changes the way you see the whole ship. Eleanor Vance, and many of the passengers seated around her tonight, are, by the 3rd or 4th day of a 5-day crossing, frequently and openly bored. The condition has a name in the vocabulary of the era: ennui, a particular genteel form of restlessness that afflicts wealthy travelers confined to a floating hotel with a finite number of activities, no matter how elaborate those activities might be. There are only so many turns one can take around the promenade deck, only so many hands of bridge one can play in the card room, only so many afternoon teas, so many evenings of dancing to the same small orchestra, so many conversations with the same 50 or 60 people one is likely to encounter repeatedly over 5 days at sea. Eleanor has felt this restlessness on every previous crossing, and she feels it beginning again tonight, even as the string quartet plays and the 6th course of dinner is cleared away. It is a peculiar sensation, this specific kind of boredom, because it exists entirely within a context of extraordinary comfort. She wants for nothing. Every meal is prepared for her. Every need is anticipated by a steward like Thomas before she has fully articulated it to herself. And within that complete absence of genuine demand, a different kind of restlessness grows. The restlessness of a mind with nothing truly difficult to occupy it. No real problem to solve, no real task to complete. For 5 entire days. The shipping lines understood this problem well, and they addressed it with an elaborate program of manufactured activity designed to fill the hours between meals. There were deck games, quoits and shuffleboard played on the open promenade in fair weather. There was a ship's newspaper printed daily aboard the vessel itself, carrying wire news received by radio, current position and mileage covered, and light social notes about which prominent passengers were aboard. There were lectures, sometimes given by passengers themselves, on travel or literature or current affairs. There was a gymnasium fitted with mechanical exercise equipment, a novelty that a certain type of passenger found entertaining precisely because it was so unusual. And there was, every evening without fail, dancing. The small orchestra playing the popular tunes of 1923, foxtrots and waltzes, while couples moved across a polished floor that itself, like everything else in this room, carried the faint, continuous vibration of the engines several decks below. None of it was enough, entirely, to dispel the particular restlessness that settled over a 5-day crossing by the 3rd or 4th night. Eleanor has watched other passengers manage this restlessness in various ways. Some drink more than they might at home, the ship's bars doing brisk business every evening. Some form quick, intense shipboard friendships and occasional romances that rarely survive contact with the passengers' separate lives on land. Some simply grow quiet and withdrawn, staring out at an ocean that offers, day after day, precisely the same view in every direction, until the sameness itself becomes its own particular form of exhaustion. Eleanor's own preferred escape is the card room, where she plays bridge most afternoons with the same small, rotating group of acquaintances, a pursuit she finds absorbing precisely because it demands enough concentration to occupy her mind without requiring the emotional performance that dinner conversation demands. For an hour or two each afternoon, calculating bids and reading her partner's signals, Eleanor experiences something close to the mental engagement that Mick experiences continuously in the boiler room. A real problem, requiring real attention, though the stakes, of course, could not be more different. A misjudged bid costs her a hand of cards. A misjudged shovel load costs Mick a burn, or worse. At this exact moment, 200 feet below the dining saloon, Michael Doyle is entering the 3rd hour of a 4-hour watch in which every single minute presents a genuine, immediate physical demand. His body is fighting heat exhaustion. His muscles are cataloguing the accumulated strain of hundreds of shovel loads. His attention is locked, continuously, on the state of the fire in front of him, because a lapse in that attention has real, immediate consequences for the ship's speed and, in the worst case, for his own safety. Eleanor is fighting boredom. Mick is fighting exhaustion. Both conditions are real. Both are difficult in their own specific ways for the person experiencing them. But they are not remotely equivalent, and the fact that they are occurring simultaneously on the same ship, separated by less than 200 feet of steel, is one of the starkest illustrations available anywhere in this era of exactly how differently the same crossing could be experienced, depending entirely on which side of that steel a person happened to be born. I do not want to judge Eleanor for her boredom. She is not a villain in this story. She is a participant in a highly controlled, carefully designed piece of social theatre, one that she did not create, and that she has no particular reason to question. Because nothing in her experience of the ship, by design, ever brings the two worlds into contact. She has never seen the boiler room. She will never see it. The ship's entire architecture, every corridor and watertight door and crew-only stairway, has been specifically engineered to ensure that she never will. The separation between Eleanor's world and Mick's world is not accidental, and it is not simply a byproduct of the ship's size. It was engineered, deliberately and with considerable design skill, into the physical architecture of the vessel itself, and understanding how that separation was built reveals something important about how the entire class system of the era was, quite literally, constructed in steel and riveted plate. The separation begins before either passenger or crew member even boards. Eleanor's boarding process, several days ago in New York, involved a private car to the pier, porters for her trunks, and a direct route up a covered gangway reserved specifically for first-class passengers. A gangway positioned to open directly onto the promenade deck without requiring her to pass through any other section of the ship at all. Third-class passengers and the entire crew boarded through entirely separate gangways, positioned at different points along the hull, opening onto different decks entirely, so that the ship's architecture began sorting its human cargo by class before the vessel had even left the dock. Begin with the most obvious mechanism: watertight doors. A ship of this size was required, for genuine safety reasons in the aftermath of disasters like the Titanic 11 years earlier, to be divided into separate watertight compartments, sealed by heavy steel doors that could be closed to contain flooding in the event of a hull breach. This was legitimate maritime engineering, and it saved lives. But the same doors, positioned strategically between passenger decks and crew working areas, also served a second, unstated function. They created hard, physical barriers, clearly marked as crew only, that the vast majority of passengers had no practical reason and, in most cases, no legal permission to cross. Beyond the doors themselves, the ship's corridor system was designed with what naval architects of the era sometimes called, without any particular embarrassment, class segregation in mind. First-class passengers moved through wide, carpeted corridors, well-lit, decorated, connecting directly to the public rooms and dining facilities of their class. Crew members moved through an entirely separate network of narrow, utilitarian passageways, sometimes called Scotland Road on ships of this era, a long working corridor running much of the length of the ship at a lower level, connecting crew quarters to work areas without ever requiring passage through any passenger space. A fireman coming off watch in the boiler room could walk the entire length of the ship, from his workplace to his bunk to the crew mess, without ever setting foot in a corridor that a first-class passenger might also use. The soundproofing, too, was intentional. The engine and boiler rooms of a ship this size produce a tremendous amount of noise and vibration, and naval architects worked specifically to insulate the passenger decks from that noise, using layers of cork insulation, careful placement of machinery relative to passenger cabins, and structural design choices that dampened vibration before it could travel upward through the hull. The goal, stated plainly in shipbuilding literature of the era, was to allow first-class passengers in particular to experience the sensation of being at sea without the disruptive reminder that a massive, continuously operating industrial machine was the actual source of their comfortable forward motion. And there is one more mechanism, subtler than steel doors or soundproofing, but arguably just as effective: uniforms and appearance standards. Crew members who did have occasion to move through passenger areas, stewards, waiters, cabin staff, were required to present themselves in a way that visually erased any sign of the ship's industrial reality. Clean uniforms, scrubbed hands, a demeanor of calm, unhurried competence. A steward like Thomas Whitfield would never be permitted to serve dinner with coal dust visible on his hands or exhaustion visible on his face, even if, elsewhere on the ship at that exact moment, men in the black gang were displaying exactly those signs after a brutal watch. The visual presentation of every crew member a passenger might actually encounter was carefully controlled to reinforce the illusion that the ship ran on something closer to magic than on human muscle and burning coal. The wage structure of the ship reinforced this same hierarchy in purely economic terms. A first-class steward, dependent heavily on passenger tips, could, in a good season, earn wages that approached or even exceeded those of a senior engineer, a fact that occasionally caused quiet friction within the crew's own internal social order. But the fireman and trimmer, whose labor was arguably the most essential and unquestionably the most physically brutal aboard the entire ship, occupied the lowest tier of that same wage structure. Their compensation set not by the value passengers might assign to visible, appreciated service, but by the simple, cold economics of a labor market in which men desperate enough for steady work were always available to replace anyone who could not or would not continue. This economic reality shaped the culture of the Black Gang in ways that outsiders rarely appreciated. The men developed their own internal systems of mutual support precisely because the ship's formal structures offered them so little. An injured fireman's watch would be quietly covered by his mates, without complaint and without any expectation of formal recognition, because every man in that boiler room understood, in his bones, that the favor would eventually need returning. This was not sentimentality, it was survival, the same practical calculus that governed every other aspect of life in the stokehold, applied to the question of how a group of men, subjected to identical hazards, might best protect each other from a system that offered them, individually, remarkably little protection of its own. The 1920s were also, not coincidentally, a period of significant labor organizing among maritime workers, and the men of the Black Gang were increasingly aware, even aboard a single crossing like this one, of unions forming in ports on both sides of the Atlantic to press for better wages, safer conditions, and some measure of formal recognition for the specific hazards of their trade.
Mick has heard talk of these efforts, mostly second-hand, from men who have worked other ships and other lines, and while he has not yet seen the tangible benefits of organized labor reach his own wage packet, he understands, in a general way, that the world he works within is beginning, slowly, to shift under the surface of the shipping industry's carefully maintained calm, in much the same way that the ocean itself shifts under the hull of every ship that crosses it, largely unseen, but never entirely still. The result of all this engineering, architectural and social, was a ship on which two entirely different physical realities could coexist, separated by less distance than the length of a city block, without ever once making meaningful contact. Eleanor Vance could cross the Atlantic Ocean 5 times and never once see the face of a single man who fed the furnaces that carried her. Mick Doyle could work 3 years aboard liners like this one and never once set foot in the dining saloon whose chandeliers his labor kept lit. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture entirely. The romance of the 1920s ocean liner, the image of gleaming white hulls and glamorous departures that survives so vividly in the popular imagination a century later, was built, quite deliberately, on a foundation of architectural concealment every bit as calculated as the concealment we have discussed in other eras and other contexts. The ship was not simply a vehicle for crossing an ocean. It was a machine for producing an experience, and producing that experience required hiding. As thoroughly and as systematically as riveted steel and cork insulation could manage, the actual mechanical and human cost of making it possible. At 8 bells, which marks the end of Mick's 4-hour watch, he and Sam Kowalski hand their section of the boiler room over to the incoming watch. A brief exchange of information about the state of the fires, the current steam pressure, and any problems encountered, delivered in a shorthand of shouted phrases that has to compete with the continuous roar of the furnaces to be heard at all. What follows is not, by any reasonable definition, rest. It is the interval between one exhausting labour and the next, and the Black Gang's off-watch hours are structured around a schedule that leaves remarkably little room for genuine recovery. Mick climbs the iron ladders back up toward crew quarters, and the climb itself, after 4 hours of continuous physical exertion in extreme heat, is its own small ordeal, his legs heavy, his balance slightly unsteady in the way that follows sustained heat exposure. The crew quarters for firemen and trimmers aboard a ship of this era are located low in the hull, close to the boiler rooms themselves, both for functional reasons of crew movement and because these were, without question, the least desirable spaces on the entire vessel, allocated to the men whose labor was considered, in the strict economic hierarchy of the shipping industry, the least prestigious, despite being among the most physically demanding. Mick shares a berth with 5 other firemen, a cramped compartment fitted with tiered bunks, barely wide enough to turn over in, with almost no natural light and ventilation that struggles to fully clear the persistent smell of coal dust and sweat that clings to every surface, including the bedding itself. The men who share this space with Mick tonight are, in their own way, as varied a group as any Eleanor might encounter in the first-class dining saloon, though their circumstances have flattened those differences into something that looks, from the outside, like uniformity. There is an older man named Grimsby, close to 50, who has fired boilers on liners for close to 30 years, and whose body carries the accumulated evidence of every one of them. A permanent stoop, hands that shake slightly even at rest, a wheeze in his breathing that everyone privately understands, but no one discusses directly. There is a younger man, barely 18, on his first crossing, whose enthusiasm for the wages and the adventure of it has not yet been ground down by the accumulated exhaustion that men like Grimsby carry as a matter of course. Mick sits somewhere between these two, old enough to understand exactly what this work costs, young enough that the cost has not yet become permanent, though he watches Grimsby sometimes in quiet moments, and wonders how many more crossings separate his own body from that same permanent stoop. Grimsby himself rarely speaks about his own future in the trade,
though the other men understand, without needing it stated directly, that his working days are numbered. A fireman whose hands shake and whose breath comes short cannot maintain the pace this work demands indefinitely. And every man in that bunk room has watched older colleagues age out of the trade before, some finding lighter work ashore, some simply disappearing from the crew rosters between one crossing and the next, their fate unknown and rarely discussed, because dwelling on it serves no purpose and changes nothing about the watch that begins again in 3 hours regardless. He does not bathe immediately, though he wants to. The crew washing facilities are shared among dozens of men working staggered watches, and there is often a queue. He eats first, in a crew mess that serves food noticeably plainer than what Eleanor Vance enjoyed several hours and several decks above him tonight, though by the standards the men themselves grew up with, in dockside neighbourhoods in Liverpool and industrial towns across Britain and Europe, the food is substantial and reliable. And that reliability was, for many of them, a significant part of what made this brutal work worth doing in the first place. A trade that, however punishing, offered a kind of stability that was not always available on shore. After eating, he washes as best he can in the shared facilities, scrubbing at hands and forearms that will never come entirely clean of the coal dust worked into the creases of his skin, and he falls into his bunk with perhaps 3 hours available to him before the cycle begins again. Sleep, in these conditions, is not the deep, restorative rest that a modern person might imagine. The engine noise is a constant physical presence even in the crew quarters, a low, continuous vibration transmitted through the steel of the hull itself, felt as much as heard. The heat, even this far from the boiler room, remains elevated compared to the passenger decks above. And the schedule itself, 4 hours on and roughly 8 hours off, repeated continuously across the 5-day crossing with no full day of rest at any point, means that the men of the Black Gang exist in a state of accumulated, chronic fatigue for the entire voyage. A fatigue that does not fully resolve between watches, and that compounds day after day until the ship finally reaches port. Mick lies in his bunk in the narrow dark with 3 hours before the cycle repeats itself, and he takes Bridget's letter from his trouser pocket, now hung on a hook beside the bunk, and he reads it once more by the dim light of a single shared bulb, though he has long since memorized every word. 2 more crossings, maybe 3. Then Liverpool and 2 rooms above a shop on Scotland Road, and an end, God willing, to the shovel and the heat and the coal dust that will not fully wash away. He closes his eyes. The engines hum on, under him, around him, through him, the same rhythm they will maintain for the rest of the night, for the rest of the crossing, for as long as this ship moves through the water at all. There is a danger that runs beneath every crossing of this era, one that neither the champagne of first class nor the practiced endurance of the boiler room can fully guard against, and it is worth pausing on before we go any further into the night. The North Atlantic, in the 1920s, remained one of the most genuinely hazardous stretches of ocean regularly crossed by commercial passenger traffic anywhere in the world. And every soul aboard this ship, from the wealthiest passenger in the finest suite to the youngest trimmer on his first crossing, was equally exposed to that hazard, whatever the ship's architecture otherwise did to separate them. The specific dangers varied by season and by route. Fog banks could descend across the shipping lanes with almost no warning, reducing visibility to a few dozen feet and forcing captains to slow their ships and sound continuous warning horns while praying no other vessel was crossing their path in the grey murk. Icebergs, calved from Greenland's glaciers, drifted south into the shipping lanes with unpredictable timing, a hazard that every officer aboard understood with particular gravity, given how recently, in historical terms, that exact danger had claimed one of the most famous ships ever built. And storms, genuine North Atlantic storms, could arrive with waves considerably larger than most passengers, admiring the ship's size from the safety of the boat deck, would ever have imagined possible. Storms on this route could develop with a speed that even experienced crews found difficult to fully anticipate, given the limited weather forecasting technology available in this era. A ship the size of this liner, close to 900 feet long and weighing tens of thousands of tons, still pitched and rolled significantly in truly heavy seas. And when it did, the experience differed sharply depending on where aboard the ship you happened to be standing. In first class, a serious storm meant an evening of empty tables in the dining saloon as passengers succumbed to seasickness in the relative comfort of their staterooms, stewards moving between cabins with basins and reassurance rather than six-course meals.
Uncomfortable, certainly, but rarely dangerous, cushioned as those passengers were by the ship's sheer size and by cabins positioned toward the more stable center of the vessel. Down in the boiler rooms, the same storm presented an entirely different and considerably more serious problem. The Black Gang could not simply retreat to a bunk and wait out rough weather. The furnaces still needed feeding, the steam pressure still needed maintaining, and doing that work on a firing floor that was actively pitching and rolling, sometimes by 10 degrees or more in either direction, introduced genuine physical hazards that calm weather watches did not carry. A shovel load of burning coal, thrown at the exact moment the deck lurched unexpectedly, could scatter dangerously across the firing floor. A man's footing, already compromised by exhaustion and heat, became considerably less reliable when the floor itself refused to stay level.
Injuries in the boiler room increased measurably during rough crossings, a fact well understood by every experienced fireman and trimmer who developed, over years of service, an instinct for reading the ship's motion and adjusting their stance and timing accordingly, the same way Mick had learned to read the color of a fire. There is a particular fear that belongs specifically to the Black Gang during a serious storm, one that first-class passengers, however uncomfortable their own seasickness, rarely have occasion to fully contemplate. The boiler rooms sit low in the hull, well below the waterline, and every man working there understands, without needing it explained, exactly what a serious hull breach in heavy weather would mean for anyone positioned in that specific part of the ship. The watertight doors that separate the ship's compartments, engineered so carefully in the aftermath of disasters like the Titanic 11 years earlier, exist precisely because the men who designed this ship understood that catastrophic failure remained a real, if statistically rare, possibility on every single crossing. Mick does not dwell on this fear during an ordinary watch. There is no time and no benefit in dwelling on it. But it exists, quietly, under the surface of his daily routine, a low, continuous awareness that every experienced man in the Black Gang carries, and that few of them ever discuss directly with each other, in the same way that Eleanor does not discuss, directly, the particular vulnerability of a woman traveling alone, without a husband, across an ocean that has claimed ships before and will claim ships again. The lifeboat drills conducted early in every crossing tell their own quiet story about this shared vulnerability. Every passenger, regardless of class, is required to participate, though the specific arrangements again reflect the ship's careful architecture of separation. First-class passengers assigned to boats positioned near their own decks, crew members assigned to different stations entirely. The entire evacuation plan itself, a further expression of the same hierarchy that governs every other aspect of the voyage. Eleanor attended her drill on the first afternoon of this crossing, standing at her assigned muster station in a borrowed life jacket, listening to an officer explain procedures she hoped never to need. And Mick attended his own drill, separately, at a station near the crew quarters. The same explanation delivered in the same tone, because whatever else separated their two worlds, the ship's designers understood that the ocean itself recognized no such distinctions. Tonight, this particular crossing, the weather has held fair. The sea beyond the hull is calm, the sky is clear, and neither Eleanor's world nor Mick's world has needed to confront this time the sharper edge of danger that always exists, quietly, beneath every transatlantic voyage of this era. But the fact that the danger did not arrive tonight does not mean it was never present. It simply means that, on this particular crossing, Both worlds were spared having to discover, together, just how thin the boundary between them actually was. It is close to 3 o'clock in the morning now, deep in the true middle of the night, and the character of the ship has changed completely from the bright, structured world of dinner and dancing that occupied its earlier hours. The ballroom is empty. The string quartet packed away their instruments hours ago. Eleanor Vance is asleep in her stateroom, her small leather notebook, tonight's single sentence about Charles already written, tucked into the drawer of her nightstand.
Above the ship, if you were standing on the open deck at this hour, which almost no one is, you would see something that the passengers rarely think about, but that defines the entire physical reality of this crossing more completely than any dinner menu or dance card. Nothing. In every direction, for hundreds of miles, there is nothing but black water and a sky full of stars undimmed by any city's light. No lights on the horizon, no other ships in sight. Just the profound, almost unimaginable isolation of a vessel in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, roughly 2 days from the nearest coastline in either direction. A small, brightly lit bubble of human warmth and activity suspended in an ocean so vast and so dark that the scale of it defies easy comprehension. On the bridge, high above both Eleanor's stateroom and Mick's boiler room, a small watch of officers maintains the ship's course through the darkness, checking instruments, scanning the horizon by eye and by the newer technology of ship-to-ship radio, a relatively recent addition to transatlantic crossings that allows this vessel to remain in occasional contact with other ships and with shore stations, receiving weather reports and position updates that would have been entirely unavailable to ships crossing this same ocean only a decade or two earlier. The officer of the watch tonight, a junior officer named Pemberton, has been at his post for nearly 4 hours himself, and there is a quiet irony in this fact that he has likely never considered directly. His watch, like Mick's, runs on a fixed rotation. His attention, like Mick's, must remain continuous because a lapse on the bridge carries consequences at least as serious as a lapse in the boiler room. The officer class and the black gang occupy opposite ends of the ship's social hierarchy, and yet both are bound at this exact hour by the same fundamental requirement that someone, somewhere aboard this vessel, must remain fully alert and fully present, all through the night, so that everyone else aboard can sleep. Down in the boiler room, the shift has changed again. Mick Doyle and Sam Kowalski are back at their posts, 3 hours of broken rest behind them, the second watch of what will become, by the time this crossing ends, a relentless cycle repeated more than 20 times across 5 days. The furnace roars the same way it roared 6 hours ago. The heat presses in the same way. The telegraph bell rings the same coded messages from the same engine room above. For Mick, this watch feels different from the first. Heavier. The accumulated fatigue of the day already settling into his shoulders and his lower back. But the work does not adjust itself to accommodate his exhaustion. The fire needs what the fire needs, regardless of how tired the man feeding it happens to be. And here is the detail that connects every single person aboard this ship, from Eleanor Vance asleep in her first-class stateroom to Mick Doyle standing before an open furnace door, from the captain on the bridge to Thomas Whitfield asleep in his own crew berth after 12 hours of anticipatory service. Every one of them, at this exact moment, is feeling the same steady, rhythmic thrum, transmitted up through every deck of the ship, through the mattress of every bunk and every first-class bed alike. The engines, the heartbeat of the vessel itself, produced directly by the labour happening in the boiler rooms at this very moment, and felt, in some diminished but unmistakable form, everywhere aboard. This vibration is the one honest thread connecting the two worlds we have spent this evening exploring. Eleanor does not know consciously that the gentle hum under her mattress is the direct physical product of Mick Doyle's shovel striking coal again and again, 200 feet below her. But her body registers it anyway,
the same way it has registered the sensation on every previous crossing, a steady, rhythmic pulse that, without her ever realizing why, has become one of the most reliably soothing sensations of her time at sea. She sleeps more deeply aboard this ship than she has slept in 14 months on land, and she has never once considered that the rhythm lulling her toward that rest is being generated at this very hour by a man in conditions she cannot fully imagine. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. The same mechanical heartbeat that exhausts Mick Doyle, that strains his back and coats his lungs and keeps him awake through 3 broken hours of rest between watches, is the exact same heartbeat that comforts Eleanor Vance into her deepest sleep in over a year. The furnace that punishes one body soothes another, transmitted through the same steel, generated by the same fire, at the exact same moment. And there is a third experience of that same vibration worth mentioning before we close, one that neither Eleanor's world nor Mick's world fully represents. Several decks above the boiler room and several decks below first class, in the more modest but still comfortable accommodations of second class, and further still in the considerably plainer bunks of third class, hundreds of other passengers are also asleep tonight, also feeling this same rhythmic pulse through their own mattresses. Third class on a liner of this era carried, in 1923, a population very different from the immigrant steerage passengers of decades earlier. Many were returning immigrants, visiting family after years working in America, or young people traveling for the first time to see relatives across the ocean. And for them, the same engine vibration that lulls Eleanor to sleep and reminds Mick of his own exhaustion carries a third meaning entirely. The steady, reassuring proof that the ship is moving, that the crossing is progressing, that whatever awaits them on the other side of this ocean is drawing measurably closer with every passing hour. Everyone aboard this ship, rich and poor, coal-blackened and champagne-soaked, is suspended together, tonight, in the same small bubble of light and warmth against an ocean of almost total dark. They do not know each other. They will likely never meet, but they are, every one of them, crossing the same dangerous, indifferent water at the same moment, carried by the same fire. Step back now from Eleanor's dinner table and Mick's furnace and look at the whole shape of what this single crossing actually reveals. Because there is a pattern here that extends well beyond one ship, 1 year, or one ocean. The first pattern is this. Luxury, in this era and in most others, was never simply purchased with money. It was purchased with someone else's body. And the entire design of an experience like a first-class Atlantic crossing was built around making that fact as invisible as possible. The smooth glide of the ship, the seamless service, the effortless 5-course dinner, none of it was actually effortless. Every ounce of comfort Eleanor experienced was the direct output of physical labor performed by men like Mick Doyle and Thomas Whitfield, and the shipping companies understood, with considerable commercial sophistication, that the value of their product depended entirely on keeping that labor as hidden as possible. A passenger who could see the boiler room, who could smell the sulfur and feel the heat, and watch a man's back bend under the strain of a 12-pound shovel, would experience the crossing very differently than a passenger who only ever saw the dining saloon's domed skylight and heard the string quartet. The illusion required concealment, and the concealment was not accidental. It was engineered, as carefully as the ship's hull itself. The second pattern is this. The ship's architecture was a caste system built in riveted steel. Every watertight door, every stretch of Scotland Road corridor, every layer of cork soundproofing served a dual purpose, one practical and stated, one social and unstated. The safety function of watertight compartments was real, but so was the function of keeping first-class passengers from ever encountering the industrial reality that made their comfort possible. Class, on a ship like this, was not simply a matter of ticket price and cabin assignment. It was a matter of which corridors you were permitted to walk, which decks you were permitted to see, which version of the ship's reality you were permitted to know existed at all. The third pattern, and perhaps the one that matters most, is this. Despite every mechanism of separation, despite the steel doors and the soundproofing and the carefully controlled uniforms, Eleanor Vance and Michael Doyle were, in the most fundamental sense, having the exact same experience.
They were both suspended in the middle of an enormous, indifferent ocean, both dependent on the same fragile hull, both vulnerable to the same storms and the same dangers that made every transatlantic crossing, regardless of class, a genuine risk in an era before reliable weather forecasting and modern safety systems. The isolation of the mid-Atlantic at 3 a.m. did not distinguish between first class and the boiler room. The dark water beneath the hull was the same dark water, whether you experienced its presence through a porthole framed in mahogany or through the felt vibration of an engine room 5 decks below any window at all. There is a fourth pattern worth naming here as well, one that extends the lesson of this particular ship into something broader about the era that produced it. The 1920s celebrated technological progress with a genuine, almost giddy enthusiasm. Faster ships, taller buildings, new inventions arriving seemingly every year, and the ocean liner stood, in the popular imagination of the decade, as one of the era's most visible symbols of exactly that progress. What the popular imagination rarely acknowledged, then or in the century since, is that a great deal of this progress rested on forms of labor that had barely advanced at all from far earlier centuries. A man shoveling coal into an open furnace by hand in 1923 was performing a task that would have been entirely recognizable to a laborer from 100 years earlier. The gleaming modernity of the passenger experience sat directly on top of a labor system that had, in its essential physical demands, changed remarkably little. Progress, in this era as in most others, tended to arrive unevenly, its benefits concentrated at one end of the ship and its costs concentrated at the other. And there is a fifth and final pattern, one that carries a small, quiet note of hope inside it. The black gang as a trade did not last forever. Within a decade or two of this crossing, the shipping industry would begin converting from coal to oil-fired boilers, a transition that eliminated the specific brutal labor Mick Doyle performs tonight, replacing shovels and trimmers with pipes and valves that a much smaller crew could operate in conditions considerably less punishing than the ones his generation endured. The men themselves did not know this was coming, not with any certainty, in 1923. But the trade that seemed, from inside the boiler room, permanent and unchangeable, was actually drawing toward its own historical end. And within Mick's own working lifetime, the specific hell he is enduring tonight would largely cease to exist, replaced by something that asked less, physically, of the men who kept the ships moving. Eleanor's ennui and Mick's exhaustion, different as they were in almost every practical sense, were both, at bottom, responses to the same condition: confinement. 5 days suspended between 2 continents, unable to leave, unable to meaningfully alter the terms of the experience. Each of them managing that confinement with whatever resources their position on the ship afforded them. Eleanor had boredom to manage, and the private grief in her small leather notebook. Mick had exhaustion to manage, and the folded letter from a girl waiting for him in Liverpool. Neither experience erases or excuses the other. The vast difference in physical suffering between a bored woman in a first-class stateroom and an exhausted man shoveling coal in 120-degree heat is real, and it matters. And this video has not tried to suggest otherwise. But both of them were, in the end, just trying to cross the dark water safely, the same as everyone else aboard, and that shared, fundamental vulnerability is something the ship's architecture, for all its cleverness, could never actually separate. The great ocean liners of the 1920s were genuine miracles of engineering. Their speed,
their scale, their ability to move thousands of people safely across one of the most dangerous stretches of open water on the planet, represented an extraordinary achievement of design and industry. But their true miracle, the one rarely credited in the advertisements and rarely remembered in the popular romance that still surrounds this era a century later, was the human endurance that kept them moving. Not the engines alone, the men who fed them. The whistle that sounded at 11 o'clock this morning, loud enough to scatter gulls from 200 feet above the pier, is silent now. It will not sound again until the ship approaches Southampton, 4 more days from this moment, and in the deep quiet of 3 in the morning, in the middle of an ocean that stretches dark and unbroken in every direction, both worlds we have visited tonight have finally, briefly, gone still. Eleanor Vance is asleep in her stateroom, on the promenade deck, in a brass bed with fine linens, her pearls set carefully in their case on the dresser, her small leather notebook closed in its drawer. She will wake in a few hours to another day of activities designed to fill the hours pleasantly, another dressing gong, another elaborate dinner, another evening of dancing to music that drifts easily over a vibration in the deck that she has never once questioned. She does not know Mick Doyle's name. She never will. But somewhere in the deep, unconscious comfort of her sleep tonight, she is receiving, without knowing it, the direct physical gift of his labor. Her small leather notebook rests in its drawer, tonight's sentence already written, and somewhere in her sleeping mind, the specific weight of grief she carries has softened, for these few hours, into something closer to rest than she has managed on most nights of the past 14 months. The rhythm under her mattress, the one she has never once traced to its source, has done what it always does, and she drifts, unaware, through the deepest sleep this crossing will give her. Michael Doyle is on watch, right now, at this exact hour, standing before an open furnace door in a room where the temperature has not dropped below 100 degrees since the ship left New York. His shoulders ache. His forearms are streaked with fresh burns, layered over old scars. In 2 hours, this watch will end, and he will climb the iron ladders back to a cramped bunk he shares with 5 other men, and he will sleep for perhaps 3 hours before descending again. And he will do this, watch after watch, for 4 more days, until the ship reaches England, and he steps onto solid ground for the first time in 5 days, his skin still carrying, in its very pores, the grey undertone of coal dust that will take days of ordinary life on shore to fully fade. You are looking at both of them now with different eyes than you had 2.5 hours ago. You know what the departure streamers and the brass band were purchasing, several decks below where anyone waved goodbye this morning. You know what the 6-course dinner actually cost, in human terms, to produce. You know that the smooth, seamless glide of a 1920s ocean liner across the Atlantic was, in reality, one of the most physically demanding, dangerous, and thoroughly hidden labor operations of the entire industrial era, performed by men whose names appear in almost no history except the crew manifests filed away in shipping company archives. You know about the 120-degree heat and the coal dust that will never fully leave a man's lungs, and the burns layered on top of older burns across forearms that grip a shovel for 4 hours at a stretch, 20 times or more across a single crossing. You know about the oatmeal water and the telegraph bell and the clinker that must be broken loose by feel in the glare of an open fire. You know about the invisible choreography of a steward balancing scalding soup against the roll of the sea, and the careful uniforms and scrubbed hands that keep every sign of that ship's true labor hidden from anyone dining under the chandeliers. You know about the watertight doors and the Scotland Road corridors and the cork insulation, all of it engineered deliberately to keep 2 worlds from ever recognizing each other, even while sharing the exact same fire, the exact same danger, the exact same dark water. Eleanor Vance is not the woman in the glossy advertisement, gazing serenely out at the ocean from a deck chair. She is a grieving widow, managing her sorrow through careful, private ritual, suspended in a confined world of manufactured comfort that she experiences, honestly, as both a genuine luxury and a genuine restlessness.
Michael Doyle is not a nameless figure in the ship's engineering diagrams, a unit of labor to be calculated alongside tons of coal and knots of speed. He is a 26-year-old man from Liverpool, carrying a scar on his forearm and a letter from Bridget in his pocket, enduring conditions that would today be considered genuinely dangerous, in pursuit of 2 rooms above a shop on Scotland Road and a life that has not yet begun. Somewhere between the two of them, in a crew berth of his own, Thomas Whitfield is also asleep tonight, his aching feet finally still after 12 hours of anticipatory service, his own particular skill set laid down for a few hours until the breakfast service calls him back to work. He too is neither the smiling, unhurried figure passengers see at the dining table, nor a simple footnote in the ship's operations. He is a man from Southampton with 6 years of accumulated craft in his hands and his instincts, doing work that both worlds depend on and neither world fully sees. Neither of them will ever know the other's name. Neither of them will ever fully understand what the other's day actually contained. And yet for 5 days they shared a single hull, a single ocean, a single fire, and a single fragile hope. Unspoken by either of them, but true of both. That this crossing, like every crossing before it, would end safely on the other side of a very large and very indifferent sea. They are both asleep now, or as close to it as their circumstances allow. Tomorrow, the performance begins again for both of them. The dinner gongs and the dressing rituals above, the shovel and the furnace below. But tonight, for these few hours in the deep quiet of the mid-Atlantic, we have seen them both clearly, and that is worth something. The furnaces are still burning tonight. They will burn for 4 more days, without stopping, carrying every soul aboard this ship safely across an ocean that does not care in the slightest about the difference between first class and the black gang. But you, wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever heavy lifting you did today in the engine room of your own life, you can put the shovel down now. The ship will carry you the rest of the way. The water is calm. The engines hum on, steady and low, beneath everything. And that sound, the same sound that has lulled a grieving widow into her deepest sleep in 14 months, is yours now too. Sleep well, friend.